All right. I didn't do any formal research for this talk except in my own head because Osmani asked me to come and talk about international agencies, which made me think, well, which one or how many? Over the years, for one reason or another, for either good or bad reasons, either lucky or unlucky, I've worked with and in about 10 different international agencies. So just using my head as a reference, I thought I would talk about a subject I knew nothing about, which is policy diffusion. So here goes, and you may learn something, or you may not. Let's see what happens. Okay. So these are some of the agencies I've worked with, some for quite a long time and some for a very short time. But the point about every one of them that I did work with is that they had an idea of what urban policy should be, and they tried to promote it. And they hire, of course, as you know, agencies never do any, the people who work for the agencies simply sign contracts with consultants like me and probably many people in this room, because we're the ones who actually write the documents, and if they have a problem with them, they can blame us rather than the agencies. Anyway, all of these agencies, in one way or the other, over the years since I started to do this, when I was quite young, had an idea of what they wanted, what they thought countries would benefit from, and therefore promoted ideas to them. For most of the time I was doing this, this was the pre-internet, it's almost a prehistoric period now. Most of the documents that we produced were printed. The United Nations for a long time produced a huge book, probably you know about it, the Global Report on Human Settlements. It came out every year, and then it started to come out every 2 years. It was a massive piece of work. I worked on a couple of them. About half the work, I think, of the United Nations UN Habitat, which I'm going to talk about, had to do with that. On the other hand, aside from all of what these agencies were trying to produce, researchers were writing their own stories all around the world. And I was lucky enough to have a very good grant during the 1990s and paired up with people in many different countries, including Brazil, UPERJ in Rio de Janeiro. And we looked at what research on urban was extant. What were people writing about all over the world? And this was pretty interesting. We found thousands and thousands of articles and books. We tried to, we had people did this from every different country, so from 41 different countries, and they, of course, knew the languages of those countries. And the one interesting thing, aside from some aspects which aren't relevant here, about that is that even though people were speaking different languages, they were talking about urbanization. But as they talked about it, they had very, very different stories to tell, and their stories were very much influenced by the major disciplines in the different regions. And this was really quite interesting because the way stories were written about cities in Africa were quite different from the way cities were written about in Latin America, partly because, at least during the time we were doing this research, certain disciplines were dominant. We almost said they were hegemonic. And this was actually quite an interesting finding because the way in which people think about cities in different regions has a lot to do with what they think are the most important questions, and those questions, by researchers anyway, have a lot to do with their discipline. So these are some of the, just the very general ideas that came out of that. But it was interesting to think about that. There was no single question that all disciplines agreed on. They all had different questions, and it was very fragmented. Okay, which one do I press? Okay, here we are. Diffusion, however, is what I want to talk about, because we're getting into the way information gets circulated. And after we did that, then we started to notice that it wasn't just the international agencies and the scholars who were writing articles in their little corners in individual countries for nobody to read outside of their own countries. The cities themselves started to connect a lot more than they had before. There's an article written in 2015 by Michel Couto, who studies these things internationally, and he found that by the year, I guess, 2015, looking around the world, and these guys are pretty systematic, there were 170 networks of cities, not just individual cities, but networks of cities, some of them including many, many cities. Most of them are financed by cities themselves, but they do get funding from international agencies to supplement them. Now, this started a long time ago, but it picked up very, very rapidly in recent decades. And this is a kind of an odd slide, because it was produced by one of my students, and she laid out all of the agencies here, and you can't see them very well, but they were some of the people who were working with me found there are about 45 networks that they were, or I'm sorry, 60, my mistake, networks that started even before 1900, and we've arranged them in decades, and you can see that there were a few in the 1900s and maybe a few more in the 1910, and of course the Great War. Then it slowed down, probably because of the Depression. It started to pick up after the Second World War, but it was pretty slow. But when you get into the 1980s, 1990s, etc., there are a lot of new agencies, a lot of new networks being formed. And this is the same story that we get using different measurements from the article I told you about before. So these networks are very important, actually, for cities. People go to them, they go to them all the time, they exchange information, they have certain reasons to go, which I won't really go into. I'm sure they enjoy the trip, but at the same time, they exchange information and they promote ideas which, for political reasons, are important for them in their own countries. How often do individual cities do this? Well, there's a study by Tim Campbell, which was quite a very simple idea, I thought. He did this, he lives in Seattle, or he lives on the West Coast someplace, I don't know where. And he went to the city of Seattle and he said, how many delegations from outside came to this city this year? And they said, well, let's look. And they had 159 delegations came to the city. Some of them had very many people with them. And once they came, they had not just one meeting, but many, many meetings with groups of professionals. So this is really that was quite astonishing. And that was in 2002, which in terms of my graph is earlier in the system, and one can assume that more of that happens now than did before. Then he did a different study after that of 53 cities around the world whom he sent just an internet interview schedule to. And you can see the maps in his book, which was produced in 2012. And people are connecting, cities are connecting all over the place. And most of them in any given year visited 10 other cities. So this is a very, very dense network. I don't have a way of mapping it, but probably Jennifer could tell me how to do that. It would. I don't know if I would be ready for what it looked like on the screen, but it definitely is a very, very intense and important relational kind of system. And I know because in the place where I work, we work with lots of cities around the world, and we have our own network with them. And we know that those cities are always visiting each other, or that they're phoning each other, or we are phoning them, or they are phoning us. So it isn't just meetings, it's all kinds of other relationships and contacts. And this is going on all the time, and more, I would say, as we go along. In addition, we have these enormous conferences, Habitat 76, 96, 2016, and we have some numbers, I guess, now and then on how many people attend, and it's a lot. I remember going to the one in Istanbul, and it was massive. It covered the whole city for certain at some periods, and there were thousands and thousands of people there from all over the place. And as David just said, people go there to have their own meetings with each other, and they don't just go there for the purpose of the conference. So now what I want to talk about is in that context. That's kind of the context of how information is moving around and is diffused, if you want to use a different word. Let's take two ideas. One is decentralization, very important idea for international agencies and for some countries. And another one is governance. So I'm going to talk about each one separately because each one is identified with an agency. The first one is decentralization. You all probably know what it means, or at least you have an idea. And I'm sure your idea is just as good as mine, giving power and resources to lower levels of government. And when we say giving them power and resources, it doesn't always happen that once you give them formal power, you also give them resources, but it wouldn't really be decentralization if you didn't. Anyway, it's happened in lots of places, and the UCLG, one of these new agencies that was formed in 2004, says that around 130 countries have adopted various versions of decentralization. This has happened for different reasons, but it's reinforced by civil society and more or less democratization, but that varies, of course, from place to place. Now, the UN Habitat is a very strong promoter of decentralization. I've been involved in about 3 projects with them in pushing it. And one of the most important documents, which we spent a long time writing, was a 28-page document. It looks very beautiful. It has an orange cover. You can get it online. There was a huge, big champagne celebration when the document was actually printed in the first decade of, I think, 2009. It was produced. It's called International Guidelines. Probably nobody ever heard of it here. International Guidelines on Decentralization and Access to Basic Services, and you can see that they're doing 2 things at the same time. They're trying to say that decentralization is linked to access to basic services, which I'm sure if you investigate individual cases is not always true, but it would be nice if it were. This was strongly supported by Anna Tibaijuka, who was the ED, which means the executive director of Habitat, for a 10-year period. I looked up how often has this document, as important as it was and as much as it cost Habitat to produce, being downloaded, 1,560 times. So that's not very much, I wouldn't say, in a world of like 7 billion people. So anyway, that's one attempt at working on this. This is a picture of Habitat inside. It looks very pleasant, actually. And this building is in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm going to show you another picture of another agency in a minute. Decentralization has tended to extend through regional connections, and one thing that made it happen a lot in Africa was when Mitterrand produced Loi de décentralisation in 1981, and then a lot of French were working in ministries in French West African countries, and they promoted this for good reason, and they began to pass legislation. Some already had it, like Côte d'Ivoire, but others began to pass it as well. So we had a lot of West African countries anyway, Francophone countries, beginning to talk much more about decentralization, partly for that reason, but there were lots of other reasons why they did it, and it was also, decentralization was supported by, in certain regions, for example, in parts of Latin America and parts of Eastern Europe. And we get a whole bunch of new constitutions and constitutional reforms, each of which has a strong statement about decentralization in it. Now, I'm going to go from that, decentralization, which was promoted by Habitat, I'll say something about Habitat in a few minutes, to governance. Governance, I never heard of it when I was a graduate student in the 1960s. I didn't really hear about it in the 1970s, but I did start to hear about it, what it meant, aside from just the manner of governing, but that's just a word in the dictionary. I started to understand that it meant something new and different in the 1980s. The concept became actually more and more used in academic literature. The high point of writing was really in the mid-1990s, but virtually everybody who uses it thinks about it slightly differently and probably defines it differently. That doesn't mean there isn't kind of an essential part of what everybody would understand to be governance in everybody's definition, but they like to think about it differently. But governance essentially has to do with what government does in addition to connecting with non-governmental institutions in order to carry out policy. A rough, not a very good definition, but anyway. We looked up in some of these guides to articles, social science articles, and two of them, the IBSS, International Bibliography of the Social Sciences, Social Science Citations Index, number 2, and you can search these indices for any word. Some of you probably have done this, and so I looked up governance, and I tried to get rid of corporate governance, which is another aspect of it which I'm not interested in, but you can do that. And you can see that per year, there weren't many people talking about it. In the 80s, it began to pick up, and now it's actually quite substantial per year. And this is in the very last column. And we can see that it's become a staple of academic writing. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because the more we understand what academics are doing, the more we can start to understand how the bank, the World Bank, which is an enormous institution, decided to work with this subject. It began to look at governance with a big report on African economies, which said that they were very poor. The economies would be much better off if Africans could govern themselves better. I'm sure most African countries agreed with that, but what did that actually mean? Eventually, the bank had to use good governance as a normative concept because it could be measured in certain ways which governance couldn't be. And finally, we get different presidents of the bank. They're very important individuals. They're all Americans, as I'm sure you know, by the constitution of the bank. Paul Wolfowitz was called the governance president, and he promoted governance, but he also promoted at the same time anti-corruption. And so a lot of people in the bank just associated governance with corruption. I'm sorry, anti-corruption. My, my mistake. Here's a picture of the bank, the inside of it. And what you're looking at, it's very beautiful in there. You have to have a pass. You can't just walk in. This building is enormous. See, they're all very nicely dressed, and they look very relaxed. This building cost, at the time, 1997, it was completed, $317 million American. So that's 20 years ago. You can imagine what it would cost if it were built now. It's very lovely inside. And that foyer that we're looking at there was renamed. Well, it didn't have a name, I guess, but it was named in the year 2012 the James D. Wolfenson Atrium, after the former president of the World Bank, who himself said that this was a knowledge bank from now on. So what he's trying to say is that the bank is a place where you learn about ideas, we'll help you learn, and it's up to you to do something with that. Currently, on the issue of governance, and this is, I'm trying to talk about diffusion of ideas here, the bank's client countries, according to their own surveys, see governance issues as the most important. If they ask them, well, what do you think the most important issues are for you in development? And they have answers which can be connected to governance in one way or the other. I don't know how much of this is interesting, but what, in my own case, I worked for about a year on this project, and I almost lived there for quite a months at a time. And what we were trying to do when I was there, this was in 2009 and 10, was to try to, and this was on the initiative of one of the bank people who hired me, obviously, and what they wanted to do was make bank loans and bank projects, which are very large, much more responsive to local community needs rather than responsive to top-down demands and requirements. So and the bank was spending around $5 billion a year on those projects. And what the bank did, however, was try to find ways of giving ideas to the people who developed. And the people who did it, these are like the ambassadors of participation, actually, in the bank, and they're called TTLs. They are called task team leaders, and they're very important in the bank. They're the ones who develop the projects, they design them, they are entrepreneurs who find support for them, and so I interviewed about 15 of them, I guess, about how they were going to do this and how they were going to do this. And they said, we have lots of problems because it's in the poorest countries that we have the most difficulty getting people to accept these ideas. But I don't have very much time to do, in fact, I have zero time to explain it anymore. So what I want to say is that both of these agencies, as important as they are, the UN is very widely spread around the world. It has a lot of legitimacy. The World Bank is very big. It has a huge budget. It has an enormous number of very good professionals from all different countries, Brazil included, working there. Habitat has international conferences all the time, but there are extreme limits from within the organizations as on how effectively these agencies are able to push these ideas. I can't really go into this. Ideas need time to develop. Local situations vary enormously. It's very hard for large centralized organizations, especially like the World Bank, to find solutions that are appropriate in complex local situations and keep on doing them when project officers change and each one wants his place in the sun or her place in the sun by promoting something new. In the end, cities, I would say, are doing a lot more themselves. They're connecting with each other both vertically and horizontally, and they have less and less need of major international agencies now than they ever did before. Thank you.